The paint roller was still dripping when the first police car pulled up, followed by a second, then a third. I wiped my brow, half expecting a SWAT team to pour out next. Instead, an officer stepped out, looking as confused as I felt. Across the street, Mr. Harrington, the smug HOA president, was waving his arms like he was directing traffic. That's the man. He's defacing HOA property. Arrest him. I blinked, staring at the half-painted front of my house. My house. Was this guy serious? The officers glanced at each other, then at me. One of them, a grizzled cop with the look of a man who had seen way too much paperwork in his life, let out a sigh. Sir, do you live here? Yeah, I said, gesturing to the open garage where my boxes were still stacked from the move. I own this place. What's the issue? He's painting his house in an unauthorized color. Harrington snapped, marching toward us like he was about to issue a royal decree. This is a clear violation of HOA regulations. I demand you make him stop immediately. The officer pinched the bridge of his nose. Sir, painting your own house isn't a crime. Harrington's face turned red. It's a violation of community standards. The HOA has strict guidelines. If we let one homeowner paint whatever they want, next thing you know, this place will look like a circus. I bit back a laugh. It's light gray, not exactly clown colors. Harrington wasn't listening. If you won't stop him, then fine him. Seize his equipment. Evict him if necessary. The cops exchanged a look, clearly wondering if they could file HOA drama under actual emergencies. The officer shook his head. This is a civil matter. If you have an issue, take it up with the HOA board. Oh, don't worry, Harrington sneered, jabbing a finger at me. I will. The cops left, likely off to deal with an actual crime, but I knew this wasn't over. Harrington gave me a tight-lipped smile, the kind that promised trouble. I was still holding the paint roller when my neighbor, an elderly woman in a floral dress, shuffled up beside me. Oh dear, she murmured. You've poked the bear. I smirked. Looks more like an angry chihuahua to me. She gave me a pitying look. You don't understand. Harrington doesn't lose. Ever. I shrugged. Well, maybe it's time he did. The HOA strikes back. The next morning, the first fine arrived, a 500 violation for unauthorized ZMM modifications. Ibra lihid to me to laugh before another notice showed up. Trash violation, 500 violation for unauthorized ZMM modifications. Ibra lihid to me to laugh before another notice showed up. Trash violation, 100. Apparently, my garbage cans weren't exactly 12 inches from the curb. Then came the grass length warning. My lawn was 2 millimeters too long. I was starting to think Harrington had a dedicated ruin this guy's life department in the HOA. But the real kicker? My water suddenly shut off. I checked with the city, no issues on their end. When I called the HOA office, I got a smug response from a receptionist. Your water bill wasn't paid through the HOA system, she said sweetly. You'll need to bring your account into good standing first. Good standing? I'd been here 2 weeks. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my house color. This was personal. Fine. If Harrington wanted to play dirty, I'd play along. I marched right to the HOA office and paid the damn fines with pennies. The receptionist's forced smile faltered as I dumped bags of loose change onto the counter. I walked out feeling victorious until I saw my car. It was being towed. I ran up to the driver. Whoa, what's going on? He barely glanced at me. HOA violation. No overnight parking on driveways. I stared at the spot where my car had been, then back at him. Where was I supposed to park? He shrugged. Garage. I clenched my jaw. My garage was still full of moving boxes. This is insane. He handed me a receipt. $300 to get your own car back. As the tow truck rumbled away, Harrington strolled up, arms crossed, grinning like he'd just won a war. Maybe you should learn how things work around here, he said, voice dripping with fake sympathy. I took a slow breath. I could feel the anger rising, but anger wouldn't help me win this. I needed to be smarter. I needed to end him. What Harrington didn't know was that I had a few tricks of my own. And this little HOA kingdom of his? It was about to fall. The power shift. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a power washer blasting my driveway. At first, I thought it was a neighbor cleaning their pavement, until I saw the bright red spray-painted letters on my garage door. HOA violator. I stormed outside just in time to see one of Harrington's lackeys, a pudgy guy in an HOA polo, trying to scrub it off. He flinched when he saw me. Mr. Harrington wanted to make sure the neighborhood knew about your infractions. I stared at him. And you thought vandalizing my property was the best way? He looked around nervously. Technically, it's not vandalism. The HOA has the right to mark non-compliant homes. I ran a hand down my face. These people were actually insane. Before I could argue, a sharp voice cut through the morning air. You have until the end of the day to remove that paint job. Harrington stood across the street, sipping coffee like he was enjoying a morning show. I gritted my teeth. Or what? He smiled. Or we escalate. I had no idea what that meant at the time, but I soon found out. By noon, I had 3 more violation notices taped to my door. Excessive noise complaint, 150. It hadn't even played music that day. Unauthorized adulteration to exterior, 150. It hadn't even played music that day. Unauthorized adulteration to exterior, 250. They were now fining me for the garage door they spray painted. And improper trash disposal, $100. My trash cans were in the exact same place as before. I wasn't the only one noticing the HOA's insanity. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, shook her head as she watched me rip down the notices. They did the same thing to the last guy who lived here, she muttered. Ran him out in less than a month. I frowned. What happened to him? She hesitated. They found violations, got his house foreclosed for unpaid fines. No one's seen him since. Foreclosed for HOA fines? This was next-level corruption. But Harrington wasn't done. The water crisis. The next morning, I went to take a shower, and nothing came out of the faucet. No water. No explanation. I checked my bills. Everything was paid. So I called the water company. Their response: your service has been temporarily suspended by the HOA for non-compliance. I nearly broke my phone. Harrington. Again. I stormed over to the HOA office, pushing through the doors like a man on a mission. The receptionist, a young woman who looked both bored and terrified to be working there, gave me a nervous smile. Mr. Harrington isn't in right now, she said quickly. I leaned on the counter. Then tell me why my water is off. She hesitated before sliding a form toward me. A reinstatement request. Your water can be restored once you acknowledge the violations and agree to the HOA's corrective measures. I skimmed the form. Admit to violating HOA guidelines. Agree to pay all fines. Obtain future HOA approval before making any changes to the property. Basically, sign away my rights or stay waterless. I exhaled slowly. Let me guess, Harrington's idea? The receptionist gave a small, guilty nod. I took the form, folded it neatly, and dropped it into the trash. Tell him I said go to hell. The final straw. I returned home fuming, but just as I pulled into my driveway, a tow truck was already there. My car was hooked up and being hauled away. I ran over. What the hell? I just got it back. The driver, barely glancing at me, handed me another ticket. Repeat parking violation. HOA Rule 47B. No parking on driveways for more than 6 consecutive hours. I stared at him. That's not a real rule. He smirked. It is now. I turned toward Harrington's house. The smug bastard was standing on his porch, watching with his arms crossed, sipping his stupid coffee again. I could almost hear his voice in my head. Maybe you should learn how things work around here. I took a deep breath. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about my house color. This was a power play. And Harrington thought he'd already won. But he had no idea who he was messing with. Because while he was playing dirty HOA politics, I was about to play something much bigger. And when I was done, he wouldn't just lose the HOA, he'd lose everything. The long game. The second time my car got towed, I knew I was dealing with a full-blown dictatorship. Harrington wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. He was using them as weapons. I'd seen power-hungry people before, but this guy? He was running the neighborhood like his personal fiefdom. But what Harrington didn't know, what no one in this HOA had even considered, was that I had resources, connections, and, most importantly, the patience to play the long game. I wasn't just some random homeowner. I was a businessman. And in business, the best revenge isn't personal, it's financial. That night, after my car was towed for the second time, I sat down at my desk, cracked my knuckles, and got to work. I started by pulling public records on the HOA's finances. Most people don't realize that HOAs, despite their oppressive nature, are still business entities. And like any business, they leave behind a paper trail. It didn't take long to find the cracks. The HOA wasn't just in debt, it was on the verge of collapse. Tens of thousands owed in unpaid contractor fees. A lawsuit pending over mismanaged funds. The HOA's reserve fund? Nearly empty. But the real kicker? The HOA had taken out a massive loan from a real estate investment firm, a firm I had a stake in. The moment everything changed came the next morning. I made some calls. By noon, I had confirmation. I now own the majority of the HOA's debt, which meant I controlled the future of this entire neighborhood. Now, I could have gone straight to Harrington's house and rubbed it in his smug face. I could have waltzed into the HOA office, slammed the paperwork on the desk, and declared myself the new king. But where's the fun in that? Instead, I waited. I let Harrington dig his own grave. The HOA's emergency meeting. 2 days later, I got an official notice from the HOA. Harrington had scheduled an emergency meeting. The topic? Addressing an unruly homeowner. Gee, I wonder who that could be about. I showed up to the meeting in the HOA clubhouse, where about 20 residents sat in metal folding chairs, looking half bored and half afraid. At the front, Harrington stood behind a podium, beaming like a dictator about to pass a new law. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, our community thrives because of our rules. And yet, we have one homeowner who refuses to comply. Someone who thinks they're above our laws. He looked right at me. I gave him a little wave. Mr. Carter, he continued, has ignored multiple violation notices, disrupted the peace, and actively worked against this community's best interests. Effective immediately, I propose that we fine him an additional $5,000 and, if necessary, begin foreclosure proceedings. Murmurs rippled through the room. Even Harrington's usual bootlickers looked a little uneasy. One man hesitantly raised his hand. Can we do that? Harrington nodded smugly. Our bylaws allow us to foreclose on any homeowner who accumulates excessive unpaid fines. If he refuses to comply, we have legal grounds to seize his property. I chuckled loudly. Harrington frowned. Is something funny, Mr. Carter? Oh, just all of this, I said, gesturing around the room. You standing up there, pretending like you still have any power. Harrington's eyes narrowed. I do have power. I am the elected president of this HOA, and I have the full backing of our. I pulled a thick stack of papers from my bag and dropped them onto the table with a satisfying thud. Not anymore. Dropping the bomb, I leaned forward, savoring the moment. See, Harrington, I did a little digging. Turns out this HOA isn't doing too hot financially. Your budget is a mess. Your funds are mismanaged. And worst of all, I tapped the paperwork. The HOA owes a hell of a lot of money to a certain real estate firm. Harrington's face paled. I smiled. And as of yesterday, I own that debt. Silence. Then someone in the back let out a choked laugh. Harrington forced a smile, but I could see the panic creeping in. That's impossible. You can't just. Oh, but I can. And I did. Which means, technically speaking, I turned to the crowd. I own this HOA. Gasps. Whispers. A woman audibly said, "Oh my God." I turned back to Harrington, savoring the sheer terror on his face. Now, let's talk about your violations. Harrington gets a taste of his own medicine. I pulled out a second stack of papers. See, while you were busy fining me for nonsense, I started looking into your record. I started reading out loud. Misuse of HOA funds. $1. 100 spent on travel expenses. Illegally hiring an unlicensed contractor. Violating HOA property rules. Your own fence is 2 inches too high. Harrington's jaw clenched. This is ridiculous. Oh, and my personal favorite. I smirked. Parking violations. Seems like you've been leaving your car out overnight, every night. The crowd started laughing. Harrington slammed his hands on the table. You can't do this. I shrugged. Actually, I can. And as the new majority stakeholder, my first order of business, I turned to the residents. Harrington is officially removed as HOA president. The room erupted. Some people cheered. Others clapped. One guy actually stood up and fist-pumped the air. Harrington looked around, waiting for someone to come to his defense. No one did, because at the end of the day, everyone hated him. And just like that, his reign was over. The aftermath. As I walked out of the clubhouse, Harrington rushed after me. You think you've won? He hissed. This isn't over. I turned to him. Oh, it definitely is. He stepped closer, trying to intimidate me. You don't understand. I built this HOA. I made the rules. You're just some guy who bought his way in. I leaned in. Exactly. And now I own you. Harrington stood there, seething, as I walked away. I didn't even need to turn around to know he was already thinking about packing his bags. Because the real fun? It was just getting started. The neighborhood's new era. With Harrington gone, I made big changes. All bogus fines. Wiped clean. Unnecessary HOA rules. Gone. Homeowners' rights. Restored. For the first time in years, people actually enjoyed living here. One evening, as I sat on my porch, Mrs. Thompson walked over, smiling. You did a good thing, she said. This place finally feels like home again. I nodded, taking a sip of my drink. Yeah, I said. It does. Then she grinned. So, what color are you painting your house next? I smirked. Whatever the hell I want. Harrington was gone, his U-Haul disappearing over the horizon like the final scene of a bad TV villain getting written out of the show. But my work wasn't finished yet. Because while removing him was satisfying, true revenge wasn't just about kicking him out. It was about making sure he never, ever crawled his way back. And of course, having a little fun at his expense. The ultimate victory. A few months later, the neighborhood threw the biggest block party in years. No HOA restrictions. No pointless rules. Just music, barbecue, and people finally enjoying their homes. I stood there, watching families laughing, people chatting freely, kids riding bikes on the sidewalks without fear of a fine. It was everything this place should have been from the start. Mrs. Thompson walked up beside me, sipping a lemonade. Never thought I'd see the day. I smiled. Feels good, doesn't it? She nodded. Damn good. Then she smirked. So, what color are you painting your house next? I chuckled, taking a sip of my drink. Whatever the hell I want. The neighborhood had changed. Gone were the days of living under the thumb of a petty tyrant. Homeowners walked their dogs without worrying about unauthorized breeds. Kids rode their bikes on the sidewalks without being fined for excessive play noise. People repainted their houses whatever colors they wanted. And the best part? The HOA actually worked for the people now. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a community instead of a dictatorship. And Harrington? Well, he was nothing but a bad memory. But before I could truly call this my ultimate victory, there was one last thing left to do.